that we have become far too, well, arrogant, that the unseen beings no longer need to exist. And I often think, well, once we no longer allow the unseen beings to not exist, what happens?
Hello, and welcome to Sacred Herbalism, the full moon segment of the Elder Tree podcast, where we explore how plants can support us to enter into a sacred relationship with life and the living world. I'm Stephanie Hazel, and I've recorded this episode beneath the gaze of epic Wollumbin, where I live in Bundjalung country, and I pay my respects to the First Nations people of this land, as well as to the spirits and plants of this ancient earth. If you love what we do, you can support the Elder Tree mission of putting medicine in the hands of the people by joining our Patreon, where you can access special teachings from our presenters and our interviewees. So, let's walk into the moonlit forest together. Are you ready? This month I interview John Bradley. He's a lecturer of anthropology at Monash University and actually was one of my lecturers many years ago when I studied anthropology and Indigenous studies at the University of Queensland. I reached out to him because his class on Indigenous Ethnoecology, or how Yanyuwa people of northeast Arnhem Land relate to their environment through systems of kinship and belonging, is one of the classes that completely changed the way I see the world. It's not strictly a conversation about plants, but I hope that you get to experience some of the brain-shifting experience I did all those years ago. And just quickly, epistemology, a word we use a lot in this conversation, simply means how people know what they know, or their worldview. So, as I've explained to everyone, I did have the pleasure of studying with you in my anthropology degree many years ago in Brisbane. And the subject that you taught was Indigenous Ethnoecology. And I actually remember the first class so well. We all walked into the room and you start off by saying, I don't do a lecture theatre style. Let's put all the tables in a circle. We're not going to do this like teacher-student thing. And you got us in a circle with the tables, and on every table there was a little pile of these yowie animals, so like the kind of Kinder Surprise on the inside, these different types of animals and creatures. You got us in groups and you said, all right, now here are all these little animals. I want you to categorize them. And so we sat there and we put them, birds and mammals and reptiles and the kinds of dinosaurs, the categories that we had been taught in Western scientific thought. And you said, great, now categorize them differently. I remember everyone just sitting there being like, well, what do you mean? You're like, well, all categories are arbitrary, so just make up a new category. So I think my group did green animals and color, and then you're like, do it again, and you just kept pushing us to almost invent these different types of ways to group and categorize these creatures, which was a really powerful way to show us that there's a really arbitrary quality to categorization of the natural world that is culturally dependent and specific. So yeah, do you remember that? Have you done that in many classes, that exercise?
I have been doing that for as long as this unit is. I still teach this unit. It's now called Hearing the Country. The Yowies come in at week 5. Still happens. Same conversation. And still the same unsettling. Students are so locked into a view of Western ways of knowing of universities that Hearing the Country still unsettles, still challenges, the Yowies still challenge, and that's the whole idea. Just to break the mold that there are more than one way to know something. Still happening. It's all still happening. I don't know. I've been at Monash now 17 years, so the Yowies still come out every year. It's
powerful exercise.
Critical transition moment.
I feel like you did it in the first class with us, but maybe that's my memory, because we're talking here, I would say 2010. So, that's 13 years ago. And I still remember it very clearly. So it's obviously a powerful way to teach. Yeah.
Well, it's called problem-based learning. which is all about student-centered learning and challenging students to unlearn. How do we unlearn anything? Is a really important concept here. It's if we want to accept other versions of knowledge that may not be of the West, we actually have to enter a process of reflection to unlearn what we have taken for granted as real knowledge. And it's the only way that you can then include somebody else's knowledge without applying certain judgments to it. I've worked in Indigenous Australian matters, for 44 years. So how do we approach other ways of knowing without the same old colonial processes just taking over?
I think that's quite relevant as a question as well for herbalists and people working with herbal medicine, because it's actually a tradition of healing that comes from me. I do Western herbal medicine, comes very much from Indigenous Europe. Like, it's very ancient in that way. And there's all this knowledge of how to use plants and when to use plants that comes from an earth-based way of knowing. And there's a huge pressure now to practice herbal medicine, to learn herbal medicine very much within the Western reductionist framework. So as a herbalist, you're trying to integrate the huge, vast base of knowledge of that tradition that is very much Indigenous way of knowing, not Aboriginal Australian Indigenous, but earth-connected way, with this reductionist scientific model. And that can be very confusing for people because there's no discussion in the industry about, I guess, that anthropological way of like, how do you integrate two very different ways of knowing? How do you do the science without then looking at all the traditional knowledge and throwing it out because you think it's superstition or ridiculous, or without putting those judgments on it?
Well, this is the challenge everywhere. Now, you're saying herbalism is only, you're coming from a Western European tradition, but what about the Himalayan tradition? Herbalism is alive and well in that world as well. And having traveled in the Himalayas and visited those places, herbalism is also there, but they're also facing exactly the same challenges where Western approaches are saying, well, prove to us what you know. And the way I often think about this is that knowledges from other cultures, whether it be herbal or whether it be land-based knowledge of other kinds, it's as if Western universities, and it's not just the sciences, it's the arts, it's the whole university system, sets up what is like a, how can I put this, a customs declaration line where anybody with knowledge that is not of the West has to line up and declare their goods. And if the goods aren't seen to fit, then they're not allowed in the door. But I think there's a stronger issue here, is that knowledge that might exist epistemologically as a whole, whether it be plant-based knowledge of Indigenous people or from the Himalayas or wherever, also gets stripped down into separate ways or separate boxes of knowledge once it hits the Western university system. So that's linguistics, that can go over there. That's music, that can go over there. That might be science, so we'll put that in botany, or that can go over into some other discipline. So whole bodies of knowledge that are dependent on a holistic view are stripped and put into little boxes where that holism is then denied. And I think in my experience, and I'm talking about the very institutions that employ me, that's one of the biggest challenges, is how do we let this kind of knowledge into a Western university, if you like? Well, there's a question as, does it even have to go in there? But if it does, how do we knock down all the boxes, the walls of the boxes, to allow that knowledge to still sit as its whole self?
Yeah, I think a nice analogy there in the herbal world is that, okay, imagine that we're talking about Ayurvedic plants, so Himalayan plants or Southern Indian plants, Ayurvedic medicine. It's like in the evidence-based medicine kind of world, someone might say, okay, traditionally ashwagandha is used for stress and insomnia. And so we'll do a clinical trial showing that one plant in this one specific context, and we'll say, okay, ashwagandha is effective. There's so many trials that have shown it's as effective as all the medications for anxiety, especially severe anxiety, but with no side effects. Okay, we've checked that one little box. So now ashwagandha can sit inside the anxiety box. But there's no willingness for that to then turn around and say, oh, maybe the whole system of understanding medicine, of Ayurvedic medicine, and looking at doshas and looking at the imbalance of different qualities in people that led people to have the conclusion that ashwagandha can be used in these ways, also has validity. At no point is those systems of medical knowledge given the tick of approval. It's only those isolated little thoughts about this plant for this problem, and never within context.
But the other issue there is the West is very good at appropriating, just taking what it wants without ever seeing how what it's taking was actually once embedded within the community from which it's taking from. And, we can, the whole colonial history of the world is about just taking what they want. But similarly with plant-based knowledge, things are just taken, stripped, without any acknowledgement that it's actually coming from a rich wellspring, a rich body of social knowledge. And that social knowledge may indeed also be very political. And yet none of those things are talked about at all in the Western category of knowing. If I think of a student of mine at the moment, a PhD student who's done some amazing research on cycad palms. Now, cycad fruit is deadly poison, absolutely full of cyanide and all sorts of other horrible things. And yet Indigenous peoples, wherever they grew in Australia, knew how to treat those plants, knew how to make them edible, because they're not just a carbohydrate, there's also protein in these things as well. Now, she did this in botany. I was on the supervisory team. But what she really wanted to talk about is how the knowledge of this plant is embedded also within the culture that has used this plant for millennia. And in one of the first meetings, one of the botanists just said, oh, look, that's just half of the first chapter. Just get on with the science, please. Because what she was also going to do was analyze for the first time this very particular species of cycad for all its constituent poisonous components, of which there are actually many. And it's the first time it's ever been done. Now, she did her final presentation for a PhD. And she opened the whole thing and said, well, look, the reality is I have just done a whole PhD based in botany, scientifically analyzing what's going on, but I've actually found out nothing new. Because the people who have been using this plant for millennia knew exactly how to treat it to make it edible. They don't need to know all this other stuff. They know that their processes work. And yet this very process of a PhD has demanded that I constantly question the people who have actually given me the information I've worked with. And part of the issue was that this plant is also embedded in really, really important stories, really, really important sites of significance on country. And yet the university just said, well, that doesn't matter. Just give us the science. Well, once you do that reductionist process and claim it as your own, you have created an epistemic violence. You've created a violence of knowledge because you have denied the millennia of ways of knowing that have also held that knowledge as well. And for me, this is a big concern. This is, you were talking about that unit you did with me. This is basically where that unit now travels into this world of, well, what is it about universities that think that they can just take what they want and not worry about how that knowledge might be held elsewhere? And, I've just given one example of the cycad palm, but in my own experiences, there are many other different plant species that can be embedded within that matrix of culture and ceremony and song and held in a really rich way. I think what I see over and over again in the years I've worked in this area is this very little thought given to the fact that people just take, and there's never anything goes back. Not even an acknowledgement, not even a thank you, not even, well, we're actually working with a tradition that actually is 3-4 millennia, it's old. No acknowledgement of anything. It's as if the West has invented it, packaged it as something brand new. And I think there are really big issues here. And and then you work with Indigenous people, or you work with people who hold these kind of knowledges, and they just look and go, how does this happen? By what right does it happen? And it's not always just about money. Sometimes it's just about an acknowledgement that other knowledge is also important, that it actually has a validity in the world, that it's allowed to be in the world. And so often, well, let's go back to the little boxes. I'm thinking of a plant species where I work in the Gulf of Carpentaria. Yes, you can use it, but it can only be used if it's got certain songs that are sung over it. We know that it has medical efficiency. We know that it can do good things. But if you were to take that into the university, the song goes that way, the plant goes that way.
Yeah.
And they never meet again, and you have torn apart the knowledge. This is the epistemic violence. This is where we take an epistemology from another group of people, another way of knowing, and for the sake of science, for the sake of knowledge production in a Western way, we're prepared to tear things apart.
Yeah, in order to prove which bit actually works.
Or which bit has value, and I think this is a really big issue. And I think what happens then is Indigenous peoples, or people who hold this knowledge in the way that it is always held, as soon as they actually start speaking out against it, so often they're classed as the shit stirrers. They don't really understand. We're actually trying to help them, and there's another whole discourse that then becomes associated with it. And they're the things I ponder a lot, because I've seen it too often. And this more recent thing with this student and her PhD on the cycads is like, well, to give you another example, in her final submission before she submitted the PhD, one of the botanists said to her, so how did these people learn to treat these things? And she answered in the way that she was taught by Indigenous people and said, because it's associated with the tiger shark, and the tiger shark gave the knowledge. The silence in the room was deafening. And in the end, it was a whole conversation about, well, of what value are these fairy stories? What value is this myth?
I think there that what you're talking about, like the epistemic violence against knowledge, which is something that in our culture we think of knowledge as this free commodity that can be torn apart in the name of scientific research. But when we say to someone that's a fairy story, or we completely discount another culture or another person's way of knowing something and saying that only science is true, everything else is superstition, supposition, or accident, then we immediately demean the people who hold that knowledge. And we almost treat them like children, as an infantilizing that happens, rather than saying, oh, I wonder what that means to them, or I wonder what I'm missing to not understand what they mean when they say, tiger shark gave that knowledge, right? There isn't that humility to be curious.
Well, and I think the issue is that we live in a world now where science sells itself as we can solve all the problems of the world. That we've got this scientism going on that is selling itself as the provider of all knowledge to actually help the world. And if we're not careful with that kind of conversation, we then do violences against other traditions, whether they be spiritual traditions, religious traditions, or whatever else, that equally provide sustenance to people, and that the two could sit side by side, but so often are not. And
violence to ourselves, because even though we're Western people, it's not like we only exist in a hyper rationalist, reductionist way of being. Like, we have our entire sensory, sensual animal bodies and our deep mythopoetic souls that are also require nourishment from other ways of knowing.
well, and of course, but the scientific view would say, well, we are objective. But the issue with any so-called objectivity is that it has been created by a subjective conversation that declares something to be objective. So it throws out the window that binary of subjectivity, objectivity even exists. It doesn't. Because objectivity only exists because of a subjective opinion that is then premised as objective.
Well, I think any subatomic physicist would agree that objectivity doesn't exist.
That's indeed right. But see, the interesting thing with that end of physics is quite fascinating, because they're actually finding out what Indigenous people or other traditions have been saying for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
They're just confirming that these things are happening. And it takes a brave physicist, but it's out there. That knowledge is being shared. But the general run-of-the-mill, generic group of human beings don't explore that deeply. But that's where it gets to. And this is really one of the big issues. And I think the other thing about this is that the West has got to a point where it thinks it can just know everything. It's allowed to have all knowledge. You can Google it, you can go to the library, you can do what you like. We should be allowed to know everything. Now, I'm thinking of another plant that I know of in the Gulf where it's very gendered. There's one that only men can know about. There's only one that women can know about. Now, I teach this in my class sometimes, and people get really upset. How dare you? We live in a world where those binaries don't exist anymore. Well, according to who? A Western world, or a world where other ways of knowledge are known? And therefore it means that, well, in this instance, only women can know. And I remember having a student in my class who said, well, if I ever worked in a situation like that, I would just storm in. How dare they even try and exclude me? And see, this is the Western arrogance that also goes with scientism, that we can know it all. We're allowed to know it all.
Yeah.
Well, are we? We don't even think about it. We just presume that that's the way it is.
Yeah, and the pursuit of knowledge is always a positive thing. I think there's that subtext in our world as well.
So, you're really dealing with some big issues here. And, it's, how can I put this? I sometimes get students or even staff that I work with say, I'm just so tired of this conversation about things being sacred. Well, there's a big word. What does that word actually mean? That word, one of the ways that unit you took with me has changed. When students come in the door now, the first thing they do before anything is they have to write down their own personal definition of sacred and their own personal definition of spirituality. And they have to hang on to it. They have to keep it. Then, after they've done all the unit, in week 12, they then have to say, well, when I walked in the door, this is what I said sacred meant. So you have 33, 40 different ways of understanding that word. And then you get 30 to 40 different views of what spirituality is. Then I say to them, has anything changed? And then they have to write a new definition. And sometimes it gets to the point where students will say, I don't know anymore. I don't know what is sacred. I don't know what is spiritual, because it depends which lens you choose to look at it through. And I think, these are, if I was to define it for myself, I think these words now get in the way of actually other kinds of knowing. Because I think these words like sacred or spirituality are really about an ability to see ourselves in relation to other things as well, not just to other human beings, but to also to non-human beings, which would include plants, which would include animals, it would include the entire cosmos, really. You know, the physicists are saying we're just stardust. How do we understand that? Because that's about a relationship that's billions of years of age. But I think from my understanding after all these years now, it's about seeing the relational at work constantly, that there is nothing that is not in relationship to each other. So when we get these extreme binaries sometimes, if you really study those binaries deeper, they're actually about a point at which relationships have been sustained and relationships are held. But what we see is this binary way of seeing things. So
explain that to me a bit more.
look, if I think of where I work, you know, at one level you can go, oh, people say women only, men only, or that's secret, that's not secret. So from a Western perspective, we're seeing them as quite big binaries. And that's how we write about them, or that's how we think about them. But if you sit with them and observe them and watch how the interplay works, underneath all of that is a world of relationships at work. And those relationships, while they may appear to be binaries, aren't binaries at all. There's actually much deeper things going on, which, you know, if I want to use a big anthropological term for where I work, it might be ultimately what is being revealed is the play of what we might call kin-centric ecologies, where all ecologies are actually in function with each other, where everything is kin to each other and marked as kin. You know, human beings are not the only ones that create kinship.
Yeah.
Human beings are not the only ones at the center of everything. You know, from the perspective where we talk here, it might be that the conversation puts a flying fox in the center and humans are on the edge, because that flying fox has relationships with so many other ecosystems, of which humans are just one part. Look, you know, I was recently in Bhutan and we were talking about global warming. Because what also gets included into this, if we want to use this term, and I use this term really warily, are the spiritual traditions that hold country as well. So now we're in the Himalayas. And one of the men I was with said, and we were talking about the glaciers disappearing. And he said, it breaks my heart that the glaciers are disappearing because the snow lions will have no place left to play. And they have a whole tradition about the mythical snow lion, well, what we might call the mythical snow lion. But for him, that was going to create a huge absence in their world. So kin-centric ecologies also bring in what we might call the unseen beings. Not just the beings that we see. And this is again the challenge. How do we allow the unseen beings to have a place? Sure, the Yanyuwa people do it, but here I am in the Himalayas, snow lions, oh, come on, you know, they're green and white mythical beings. And yet here we are talking to 60, 70-year-old men and women, seeing the glaciers retreat. The kids are there as well. And their biggest grief is that once they've gone, the snow lion goes too. The sustainer of the glaciers is gone. So we're talking about also, yes, in kin-centrism, but we're also talking about the rules, the law, the way that knowledge is actually held. And I think, you know, that's the other way, is how is knowledge actually held? Who gets to hold that knowledge? And what do we get back to the same question of when this knowledge comes into places that have interrogated all ways of knowing for so long, how do we actually put the brakes on it? Let me ask you a question. How do we put, I was thinking about this after this experience. How would we allow the snow lion to be respectfully entered into a classroom without being just classed as an animal of myth? If you put an Indigenous sense on it, how could you allow a rainbow serpent to be put onto the table to be discussed as a legitimate being without just being dismissed?
Well, you'd have to change
So
the
this,
epistemology that we have that says that only the things we can see and measure exist.
well, that's exactly right. And this is, again, the problem.
Yeah.
That we have become far too, arrogant. That the unseen beings no longer need to exist. And I often think, well, once we no longer allow the unseen beings to not exist, what happens? The unseen beings that protect the plants, the unseen beings that protect the processes of plants being turned into something else, the songs that allow the process of plants being turned into something else, the way a plant must be handled, the way a plant must be packaged. And this is, I really ponder this because I think, what are we losing? And I think we lose a sense of ourselves. We create a sense of the us and them. And yet, if you look more deeply, I'd say that the world is in a place where it is really hungry for wholeness, but it doesn't know how to actually find that wholeness, because to find wholeness comes with rules. To find wholeness comes with deeper ways of knowing, of deeper knowledge. And a lot of people aren't prepared to actually sit to learn that knowledge. Or when they hear it, they dismiss it outright because it doesn't fit the preconceived notion of what they want wholeness to be.
I think that there's something there where we have, if we think that we should know everything about everything, then we automatically can't know anything very deeply, because having knowledge about something requires consistent time and attention that you are not putting somewhere else, right? So there has to be a willingness to sacrifice knowledge about certain things in order to have really deep knowledge about certain things. And I think the same holds true with plants. As a herbalist now, you're expected to know 100 plants, but you can't know 100 plants. You can't have a relationship with them. You can't know the stories. You can't know them deeply with wisdom and true collaboration with them as non-human beings if you know that many plants. Maybe when you're 100.
This concept of wisdom is a really interesting one. Because what creates wisdom? Wisdom was once predicated on experience. Now, we tell students, university students, once they've graduated, they are at the peak of knowledge. They have acquired knowledge. Sure.
That's not the same thing, though.
But is it No, it's not. But some students think it is, because they can cite their texts, they can cite, their lecturer, they can cite the books they've read, thinking that that's a kind of wisdom. But it's not. Wisdom can only come from praxis, the actual doing of something. Because, it's a bit like saying, you're a herbalist. Let's think of just, you know what a lemon is. I know you do. But let's just pretend that you think you're an expert on lemons because you know what they look like, you know what they chemically are composed of, you know what they might be able to be used for. But if you have never tasted, touched, or smelt a lemon, then you don't know lemons. You know nothing about them at all. So therefore, yes, you're an expert, but you have no wisdom at all in regards to taste, in regards to smell, in regards to anything.
I heard them say you need to have made a lemon liqueur and grown lemon trees and harvested them and made a lemon cake and given this cake to all your friends and had your lemon crop go horribly wrong a few times, and then you might really know lemons.
And of course, in anthropology, this is what we have our theory, but then you have praxis. And the praxis is the actually doing of.
I'm curious, when you have worked with Yanyuwa communities, what you've observed there around the practice of herbal medicine and how those plants and the use of those plants fit into this kind of, kinship ecology.
Well, all plants are not just plants. All plants are ancestral beings. Okay? That's the starting place. So even at the minimal, you can walk up to, let me think, a billy goat plum tree. We know it's got high vitamin C, blah, 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 blah. But the most important thing first is that who you are as an individual will determine what your relationship is to that plant. What you will call that plant, not just the name of the plant and language. Is it your mother? Is it your father's father? Is it your mother's father? Is it your mother's mother? So you can walk through the bush, and if you wish, and I have done this with old people because it interests me immensely in terms of this kin-centrism, what do you call this plant? Oh, that's my mum. What do you call that plant? Oh, that's my father's mother. Now, once people start this, they're also talking about their obligations to that plant. Obligations of how they must relate to it. Do they have the right to actually take its fruit? Do they have the right to cut it down? Do they have the right to do things with it without actually asking other members of their family? Okay, so there's certain plants that, anyone can go and get. But there are other plants where you must ask permission.
And you mean asking permission of a particular person in your community who has a different kind of relationship with that plant?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And so this is kin-centrism that is then held by law, LAW, rules and regulations. And all beings, human, non-human, have law. Now that law can be demonstrated by the rules about how you can access those things, but the law might be demonstrated by the songlines that hold that knowledge. The law might be demonstrated by the way that plant is danced in ceremonies. So you've got here a body, a huge body of knowledge that might surround what we just think is, the tiniest little plant that just grows in a rock. And yet it's not just a tiny little plant growing in a rock. It's got a whole lot of other ways of knowing. And I think that's what I really enjoyed learning. I think how is all of this that we just call the environment, or if we understand a little bit, country, how is all this held and who holds it and what are the political forces that hold it? So previously in this conversation, I talked about the cycad palm. It's held by intense politics. You just don't randomly go up to a cycad palm and say, I can do what I want with you. You've got to ask people. You've got to have conversations with people.
It's interesting because we have a lot of, in this podcast, a lot of people talk about, asking permission of a plant. But the way that most people mean that is, when you're harvesting a plant, just asking in your heart, hi there, plant, I'm going to harvest you. Is that all right? And listening out for an answer and hoping that you get that right. But I love that what you're speaking about is actually because the people are in relationship with all the living world in very specific ways that changes depending on what kinship group you're in or what skin name you are, then that means that there are other people in your community that you have to ask. And it's their job to, I guess, in a way, monitor the population of the billy goat plum, is that what you said? Or the cycad palm. And
Well, what you've got is a matrix at work that no one person can know everything. It's all dependent on your relationships with everyone else. So, if you put, say, a particular plant in the center of the circle, then you've got all these people who are occupying the circle. the cross lines between all those people are how the knowledge of that species is being held. Whether it's seagrass, seagrass that dugongs and turtles like to munch on, cycads, billy goat plums, there's so many trees, bloodwood trees, ironbark trees, on and on it goes. And certain people are experts at divulging this kind of knowledge, walking encyclopedias of knowledge. But of course, where I work, when I first went there 44 years ago, there were about 300 speakers of Yanyuwa. Today there are 3.
Oh, wow.
And one of the issues, of course, is that so much of this knowledge is held by language. And the complexities of the language that has the ability to talk about these things. If a language begins not to be spoken and is replaced generally by English, you also see language, the knowledge of things disappearing as well. And, we know this ecologically, that where environments are sustained healthily, where there are indigenous peoples, the country will still be strong, the ecologies will be strong, the languages will be strong. Where countries have been undermined and devalued, so often what we find is also that the languages and the people themselves have been devalued. There is this absolute link between healthy ecologies and healthy languages. And, Australia is in a precarious situation about holding on to languages. And it's really only in the last 20 years, perhaps, that the ecologists and the botanists and all these kinds of people interested in the environment have begun to understand that knowledge of indigenous languages actually reveals enormous amounts of knowledge that are of value. And for so much of Australia now, it's nearly too late.
I imagine a lot of the knowledge about plant medicine also exists very much in language, right? And I find often there are a lot of words and concepts that in my work as a herbalist, I borrow from other cultures because there isn't an appropriate word that explains, that particular property of a plant or how that plant will affect the way that the blood moves in the body, or there's these kind of complex ideas that are not able to be described using English or scientific language. And if you don't have the words for them, you can't really use those concepts and you lose them, right? And all of the knowledge about how to work with that thing becomes lost.
This is what we call semantic domains. All the knowledge that lives around one thing and how that is held. And there's been research over the last 10 years in Australia where we know that the rich semantic domains of knowledge that might be held by indigenous languages do not translate across into English. They just don't. So what you get is maybe just the common language name for that plant will still come into English and be used, but all that other knowledge does not transfer across. And then this, of course, leads to stuff that I've been involved in too, is how do you document this knowledge? How do you actually document it in a way that richness and fullness of plant-based knowledge or whatever you're looking at is actually still being documented in a way that makes sense? And as you rightly said, how do you translate sometimes? There's that old Italian expression that if you're a translator, you're also a traitor.
Interesting.
Because have you got the translation right? Like, I've written a 2-volume Yanyuwa encyclopedia. I still look at it sometimes and I go, that's not the best way to describe that word.
I just feel really lucky, actually. I grew up bilingual French-English, and then in my early 20s, I was spent quite a bit of time in South America with no English-speaking people around. So through my life, I've been fluent in French, Spanish, and English, all very related languages, and have a kind of conversant level of Japanese. And growing up bilingual was a really good primer for being able to do epistemological switching in anthropological studies and as I continued in my life, because you realize that I grew up in a household where sometimes certain things had to be said in French because you couldn't quite express that in any other language, and that helps you
Yeah.
understand that
But
that there are things that can't be expressed in one way of thinking.
but the issue here, and I mean no offense here, is that you're speaking majority languages.
Yeah.
They're languages with many millions of speakers. When you see a language that had 300, which was considered quite a lot, reduced to 3, there are questions also here about how many white people have ever bothered to actually learn so-called minority languages, which comprise basically 97% of all languages in the world. The
I was
other 3-4% are the big languages that are going to just keep on going anyway. English, Spanish, French, Chinese. There are big questions here also about how that body of knowledge contained in those big level languages actually responds to languages that actually have no sort of political clout at all. And it is a really big issue. Like, I think it's a profound loss that, I know this 93-year-old woman, she's still alive and well in the world. She's a walking encyclopedia about fish, plants, birds, you name it. She will die and no one will mourn the loss of that knowledge at all. And yet, there is so much that she knows.
And probably a lot of the things she knows can't just be written down in a book, because then you would lose the context in which that wisdom exists.
Well, this is the big issue, and one makes the attempt, and she's a part of the attempt as well. But you're right. Once you, as you rightly said, there are concepts in other languages. I grew up speaking other languages as a kid too, and there are concepts. Even to what I'm thinking of at the moment is the smell of your chopping board after you've chopped garlic or something, and the chopping board still smells. Well, in Arabic and Hebrew, there is actually a specific term for that smell, and how you must try and how you actually get rid of that smell, so your chopping board is untainted, if you like. But these are big issues about knowledge. There are big issues about other ways of knowing, other epistemologies, the ontological basis of that kind of knowledge. And, if you think of Indigenous languages, if Indigenous languages were once an old growth forest in Australia, we have only got remnants of that growth forest left.
Perhaps not a
And,
coincidence. We only have remnants of our old growth forests left. We talk about that connection between ecological health and cultural health and language that you were just referring to. They have gone hand in hand in Australia, the pruning and the devastation of the environment, along with the cultures and languages that were
and
embedded.
similarly, it's happening in many other parts of the world as well. The Amazon, for example, is a critical case study. Parts of the Himalayas are critical case studies. The warning signs are there. You see it. When you've sometimes lived in Australia and you've experienced, so much degradation, and then you go to other parts of the world, such as the Amazon or the Himalayas, you sense it immediately. And unless something is remedied very quickly, you know what the outcome is going to be.
Yeah.
And this is about, at one level, the power of the West to presume that it knows that it's somehow right, that it's objective, that it has the science always in front of it to make sure that nothing bad goes on. Well, I'm not convinced. I think this notion that science is always going to provide a way is a feel-good narrative with so many faults.
Feels very adolescent to me, that narrative, but
Yeah, but adolescents, having grown up them, very arrogant little souls for a little while.
I want to circle back to what you were talking about with, the Yanyuwa peoples that you've worked with, and how they exist in relationships with different plants, and harvesting plants requires asking permission. When you talk about that, to me, that sounds like a very dispersed kind of knowledge as well, that the knowledge, because it's held in many
Oh,
people's hands, feels dispersed. And I'm curious if in your work there, whether the practice of herbal medicine in something that, the way we would think of that, whether there are people in that community who hold that type of knowledge more strongly, that other people come to for help with ailments and illness, or whether it is really dispersed throughout the whole community in that way.
once it was very dispersed, but there was also the experts, if you like. There was always the professors, both men and women. But as languages no longer spoken, these things disappear very quickly. So now you might have isolated pockets of people that remember certain plants are good for things, and perhaps for more common ailments such as flu, colds, ringworm, COVID, nearly everyone knows what plants you go to do it. But if you were to, and I've done this, if you were to say some of the younger people, yeah, that's the plant. Do you know what family own that plant? What clan owns that plant? No, I don't know. Do you know what that plant is called in language? No, don't know. Do you know where that plant is actually dreaming? No, I don't know. So the plant is still being used, but now it's a little bit like buying your bottle of Panadol in the chemist shop. Anyone can go and do it, but everything that once sustained the knowledge of it is not there. And that's the biggest thing you see once the foundation of language and all that it contains begins to break away. I speak 3 Indigenous languages, and I know that just because you know one doesn't mean you know everything about the other, and that can go about plants as well. The way a plant in one group is treated may not be the way the plants are treated in another community, because there are different epistemologies based in those languages about how knowledge is going to be held. At the end of the day, all truth is relative.
And it is very possible that plants work differently depending how they're treated, right?
And also the soil they grow in.
Totally. Yeah. I teach groups of herbalists, take them through this process of taking herbs and doing a daily meditation with the plant without knowing what it is, as a way to kind of get some experiential knowledge where the mind can't interfere too much with what you think you're going to, everything you know about that plant from a scientific perspective, coming to filter what you're actually noticing. And what interests me is I notice that the plants seem to work so much more strongly in that context, people having really profound experiences on tiny doses of herbal medicine, because every day they're sitting there, they're taking the plant, they're meditating with the plant, they're like giving it a quality of attention and reverence, and doing a little process that everyone agrees to do with it. And the very way that they're doing that changes the biological and psychospiritual effects of that plant.
I've worked with people that will say we don't use that plant anymore because we don't have the song to sing to it. And unless you've got the song, you can't use it. Singing is, if you want to use your terminology, is also meditative. It's engaging with a process. So this is not a unique vision. This is all over the place, this kind of understanding of how plants must be used. Or, in the Himalayan herbal traditions, the mantras that have to be put over the top of herbal remedies from plants that are put together, thousands and thousands and thousands of mantras have to be recited before anyone can even touch them. So, these are not unique circumstances at all. These are understanding the relational. Unless there's a relational process at work, things don't work properly.
I'm curious whether you think there's, if you think about the audience and people who are listening to us now, being a lot of herbalists, naturopaths, also just plant passionate people in Australia, we talked about some really big concepts, and I'm curious what you think is important or relevant for people to be thinking about out of our conversation in their work with herbal medicine.
I think acknowledge complexity. That nothing that is in front of you has just arisen in front of you. It's come from somewhere. It's come from another place. It has been held in other ways. That doesn't mean you have to take it all on board, but it would be great to recognize the complexity. You know, my partner is an incredible gardener and really interested in the history of where plants are coming from and what they're doing and how they're doing it. And that complexity, instead of dividing good, bad, all the binaries we can think of, but just saying, here it all is. Here's all this knowledge. And just by rotating that ball of complexity, allowing other visions of ways of knowing to refract there without challenging it, without asking, without saying, well, science hasn't proved it, or, oh, well, we don't need the song, or I don't know. I just think we've got to stop being so simplistic about things. That we really do have to take on board that these knowledges, especially coming from other cultures that we now use, have a place. And even if we don't want to use them all, accept that they're a part of the process of knowing about that plant. If I go back to the cycads, Yanyuwa people are the only people in the world that we know of that had one process where you fermented the cycad to get all the poisons out. And it was a process that took 3 months. But you didn't dare do it unless you sung over those fermenting cycads with certain power songs. Now, we replicated that in a laboratory at work. And one of the people at this same presentation said, and did you sing the songs? As if it was sort of how ludicrous that you would even say yes to this. To which we did say, well, yes, we did. And is that going to be in the thesis? Yes, it is. And the raised eyebrows amongst the learned community. Why? It is about knowledge. Knowledge is the key to all of this. But knowledge just isn't one box. Knowledge is vast.
That's it for this moon cycle. Thanks for joining me in another layer of this fascinating conversation we are having about the role of the sacred in our lives as herbalists. If you know someone who would love this episode, then send it through to them, as our work strengthening our herbal community through grassroots herbal education starts right here. I'll see you next time the moon is round in the sky, and until then, I wish you good health and many plants.